As a parent, we have lots of things that we have to worry about, right? I mean, there's cyber issues, right? There's that cell phones, there's alcohol, there's driving. This is just another topic, and this topic this is a topic that you should be discussing anyway, whether you're in a regulated market or not, because I can promise you this stuff is available.
The bottom line is, how do you get them not to use? How do you do that? Years of scare tactics, and what we know is that they have been ineffective. The scare tactics have resulted in a certain amount of cynicism among kids, so that they actually are very skeptical about what adults tell them about drugs.
I think overall what I'm seeing is we have taken something that has been taboo and that we've been brainwashed for however many years about, and we're finally starting to unravel that a little bit.
We've got too many drugs in our society to begin with. You know, there are only 2 countries in the world, for example, that allow the advertising of prescription drugs. We do, and New Zealand does. We constantly have this message that drugs are good for you. You rarely see the consequences of getting high or getting drunk on TV or in movies. And kids learn at a very young age. They learn from all these depictions. And what they learn is that you can fool around a little bit and get away with it.
I think any kind of drug education has to be interactive. They have to do their own research. You know, ultimately they're going to make their own decisions about this stuff.
We know that young teens are influenced by the photos that they see on social media. So in our study, we want to go see teens in our communities and code their Snapchat stories and see how prevalent smoking weed and how prevalent that is in their stories, and see if they're influenced by it.
I think the whole thing is just opinions, and you got two.
We designed the course to be student-led, so the students did their own research on different topics in psychology and presented to their peers.
And for the study, we're just trying to see the prevalence of like alcohol, nicotine, and marijuana-related content.
I personally expect to find a lot of marijuana usage within Snapchat, because I think that teens think it's okay to post on Snapchat because they think it goes away.
What does social media like actually bring to teenagers that's positive?
So we learned about how being exposed to stimuli can impact our attitudes about them. Just being exposed to something can make us more favorable to it, and particularly if that thing that we're exposed to is associated with peers or people that we find likable, it can impact our attitudes, our estimates of whether something is normal or acceptable, and consequently our behavior.
We've done practices in the class with Snapchat accounts, and we have actually coded some with pot and with vaping, and it just seems normal nowadays. This is ridiculous. I've never done this, I swear. Like, look this up.
Marijuana mania.
See, there's this too.
Yeah. Some guy like hugging a marijuana plant.
Good night bowls.
Yeah. Really, really big joint. So.
That's a huge joint. It can't be real.
It's pretty hazy, and just everyone's just doing it, and yeah.
Teens think that there's nothing to be afraid of. So I think that's why usage has gone up. Whereas in tobacco, you hear about people getting lung cancer, and there's a lot of health risks that go along with that. But there isn't much research done on marijuana, and I think that's why teens think it's okay to smoke it.
I think a lot of parents, at least what I've noticed, I don't think they really realize how common it is nowadays. I think they're kind of in the dark with it.
Since there's so much ambiguity about marijuana and there hasn't been a lot of research done on it, they're just kind of scared of it almost. Like they don't know if it's good or bad. So I think their stance on marijuana is just confused.
Yeah.
I think a lot of parents are too.
Attitudes are changing, and among adolescents, there's definitely been shifts in attitudes across the last decade that, at a minimum, correlate with legal changes.
Because we're regulating it, we are making it safer. We are making sure that it's not falling in the wrong hands and making sure it's going through proper channels. You're limiting the availability to underage kids.
What kids understand is that you have illegal drugs for which you get arrested and incarcerated. And then you have legal drugs, which, unless you're underage, you don't get arrested for. But what they also know is that the reason that certain drugs are legal and illegal has very little to do with the health impact on them. If we were only looking at health and deciding which drugs were going to be legal and which were going to be illegal, wouldn't cigarettes be illegal by now?
What I tell parents is there's no reason to have the big talk anymore. You can have 100 little talks because you're watching something on TV or you're at the movies and there are scenes of drug use or violence or sex or whatever, and talk about it. You know, what do you think about that? Why did they do that? Why is the anti-hero always smoking cigarettes? Why do people giggle about marijuana use and there's never any harmful effects? You know, nobody gets into an automobile accident. I think the ideal time is actually when they're preteens, when they're 7, 8, 9, 10, because they're still in your pocket. They still love you. If you use marijuana, I guarantee you, your kids will find out. They will find out. And so you gotta own up to it. I mean, you gotta, kids need to see you as being human, as being capable of making mistakes. So use that to your advantage. And the way to do that is to say, look, I made some mistakes when I was your age, when I was a little bit older. I occasionally smoked marijuana. It wasn't a good idea then, and it certainly is not a good idea now. What's out there now is 20 or 25 times more concentrated than what we used. So we're talking almost about a different drug.
On average, our flower and house tests anywhere from 20% THC to 25%. What that does is then breaks it down to about 75 to 85% when we extract all the THC and terpenes off the product.
I pledged in my campaign for the presidency to end the war. We can win.
In the 1960s, you had this explosion of a couple of different things. This was something associated with Vietnam War, the soldiers there using it, and the drug really became associated with anti-establishment attitudes. This was a challenge to Nixon and other authorities. And what Nixon did basically was introduce this very belligerent language of the war on drugs, and he increasingly funded that. The U.S. government during the 1970s was increasingly involved in Central America in terms of suppression of drug production. The effectiveness of controlling international supplies during the 1970s shifted a lot of the effort in the United States towards indoor production. And the main reason people started growing shorter plants indoors was you could grow it in your closet.
It comes out here and it's weighed, and when it's weighed, the weight is recorded on the tag and then it's entered into the computer once it starts going through the harvest process. We'll take the top part of the plant and trim that by hand. The middle part of the plant will go through our auto trimmer, and the bottom part of the plant, all these little nuggets, we don't waste any time trimming those. Those goes right to the hash pile. So those will be extracted for oil. All the little leaves on here will also be saved, and those will go through the extraction process as well.
Every flower has a little bit different smell, taste, high, whether it's a sativa or an indica. It's going to have different effects for what you're looking for, whether it's recreationally or medicinally.
So we'll start humidifying, and this really is the beginning of the process, just like a cigar, or an aged wine, or an aged liquor. We track every single aspect of this plant, and so even the waste has to be tracked. All of that is going to our extract. And we'll make beautiful oils out of that for our patients and customers.
This is live resin. What it is the whole plant fresh frozen process. The plant is cut, and the day it is cut, it is frozen immediately and ran within 24 hours of its new life. So we can use it in various ways, from vaping to dabbing to putting it on top of a bowl of flour. And I mean, there's countless ways to do it. The most effective, I would say, is vaping or dabbing. And what that is it's a temperature around 400 to 700 degrees where it vaporizes that complete oil, and you're getting the full effects, full entourage effects. You're getting taste, the high, and everything else that comes along with the terpenes.
Absolutely different drug. You have no idea of how powerful marijuana is now compared to what people used in the 60s and 70s. And there's still a lot that we don't know about marijuana functioning, but clearly it affects people's brains, it affects your short-term learning.
It's one of the most important things that we do with our brains is store information in a way that we can access it. So adolescence, when our brains are developing, when our brains are doing the final formative growth and development, is probably the most dangerous time to be using drugs and alcohol.
Now move your head slightly to the left.
We gave a battery of neuropsychological tests to these kids, and what we asked them to do was to learn and memorize a list of words that we read to them over 4 learning trials. We also asked them to memorize a short story and remember a complex figure. We gave them all of these stimuli over multiple trials, and then we waited 20 minutes while they were doing other tasks to see how well the information had gotten in. Well, the first issue was that they weren't able to learn it well. Their scores on the first trials were at the bottom of the study. These kids didn't do well. They weren't able to recall the information or recognize the information at the end. These were the kids that were the marijuana users. These were the ones who had the most trouble with learning and memory in the study. And the more marijuana they used, the worse their learning and memory was. It was highly statistically significant.
With cannabis, there are other risks too. So for instance, the research really shows that the younger somebody is when they start to use it, especially if they use it heavily, and if they have a family history of psychosis or a personal history, so they have genes for this, it also increases their risk of developing schizophrenia, which is a lifelong illness that we do not have a cure for and causes very significant impairment.
Every psychiatrist, to be board certified every 10 years, you have to be re-examined. And so on that test was that question: what drug is most likely to trigger schizophrenia? And it's cannabis. More than amphetamines, more than cocaine. Counterintuitively, hallucinogens don't seem to really increase the risk at all. Based on a recent study where they looked at 108 different genes associated with schizophrenia, that the more of these genes that you have, the bigger effect cannabis use in adolescence has on your brain development. Obviously, millions of kids smoke pot and don't get schizophrenia. But schizophrenia is such a bad illness, people get sick and they stay sick for their whole life. The best figure is about 0.7% of the population of the world will get schizophrenia. So if you could prevent that from doubling, increasing by 50% by just putting off until adulthood, that would be worth it.
This risk of developing that appears to be largest if you start using in your teen years as opposed to later. Using substances with abuse potential before age 19 significantly changes the trajectory in terms of school and college and relationships, etc. Also, teens are more impulsive and more risk-taking as a whole, and so any type of intoxication increases the risks of getting into trouble doing that, whether it is unsafe sex practices, whether it is unsafe driving or not wearing a seatbelt. These sound kind of minor, but they can be life-changing for a teen.
It does appear that it probably increases your risks for doing other drugs also. Probably through this change in brain development.
Not everybody that smokes pot gets addicted, but the point is some people do. And for Michael, he loved it, and the opportunity for something harder came available to him because drug dealers are in it for the money. And if you get them hooked on something stronger, they're a customer for life. Eventually with Michael, he was offered a pill, and all he had to do was contact his drug dealer that he bought the pot from, and then if he didn't have the stronger stuff available, someone else did. Eventually took his life. Started with marijuana.
Studies show that about 11% of people who use cannabis with any regularity can develop a cannabis use disorder, or what we call an addiction, which is actually a well-defined diagnosis. And then people who use it on a daily basis have much higher, have about double or triple that rate of developing an addiction.
It's also important to not market this or have this be available to teen users, just like alcohol, just like cigarettes. You have to be a certain age to drive. There's responsibility that comes with age, right?
We have all of our strains after every batch tested for both the different kinds of THC and CBD. We do have strains like Charlotte's Web R4 that don't have THC in them. We have about 200 strains on file. So with that, we can do all sorts of breeding projects to create thousands of strains if we want to over time.
Place your left foot on that imaginary line. Place your right foot in front of it. Make sure your heel touches your toe.
Field sobriety tests are a little bit different on people under the influence of cannabis because they forget your instructions.
Make sure you touch your heel to your toe on each step.
Like we do have with alcohol, there's no actual test to say, well, someone's impaired by a certain amount of nanograms. And so we have to rely on the officer's observations at the scene and their field sobriety testing.
We see legalization sweeping across the country, but there are collateral consequences to it. So I've started these series of classes called Marijuana DUI Investigations. And one of the components, perhaps the most controversial component, is the Green Lab.
I want to welcome you guys to our Green Lab tonight. We're very appreciative that you guys came out and did this. These officers have been geared for many years to smell it and think there's a crime going on here. And that's not the case anymore. And so the whole purpose of this class is really, is that person impaired to the extent that they should be arrested or prosecuted? Or is there a level of comfort in saying, this person's actually okay to drive?
We have a handful of volunteers come in and dose. The law enforcement officers meet them before they dose.
I work for Easter Seals. I work with developmentally disabled adults. Yeah, I've been doing that kind of work for a long time. I just moved here in July.
So they get to see how they are, what their affect is, how they walk, how they talk. Just a short conversation, just to see how they present.
Anything else we want to know?
Then they leave the hotel, they go and dose.
So this evening we have 4 volunteers.
How are you?
The first volunteer is going to be taking 150 milligram chocolate edible, and then we're having others take 3 dabs of concentrates off of a little dab rig that they use to inhale the concentrate. And then for our third volunteer, we're going to have 3 bong hits. Then we're going to have somebody smoke just 1 joint. We get a bit of a full spectrum of everything.
The first time I ever smoked, 14. First time I started smoking on a regular basis, I was probably 20. But I have a chronic medical condition, so it's either that or I take 4 or 5 different prescriptions. I have fibromyalgia, so. Probably when I was 13, 7th going into 8th grade.
Looking back when I was younger,
definitely wasn't safe, especially like young kids. Like, you don't know where you're getting it from.
What it's cut with.
Yeah. There's definitely some shady kids that God knows what they could have laced it with. But yeah, to know exactly where it's coming from, yeah, it's pure.
Well, you don't have to be shady about it anymore.
This is your vaporizer pen. So this is what gives the ability to heat up the oil, the concentrate that's in the vial here. And it's totally chargeable via Android USB. And then this you fill up with the concentrate. There's wax, there's shatter, and then there's also going to be CO2 hash oil or honey oil because it parallels similar in look to honey, basically.
Anything from butter to sodas to candies, cereals, juices, hot chocolate, any food product you can do. All you have to do is get the basic butter, and you can. I've literally gotten butter and just smeared it on toast and made cinnamon toast for breakfast. Yeah, it's can of butter.
You wouldn't drive now, or does it matter? Does it
I'll
hurt?
drive right now.
You would or wouldn't?
I would.
Because it doesn't impair you.
No, it makes me more
Alert.
aware. I'm like
I focus better with school.
less distracted than like seeing people driving down the road on their phone, eating, yelling at their kids.
They come back in, the officers run them through the roadsides.
While focusing on the tip of my finger, you're going to follow my finger with your eyes and your eyes only. Don't move your head.
Okay.
Do you understand?
Gotcha.
Okay.
The way we set it up is they're trying to make a determination of what would you do with this person? Would you arrest them? Would you not arrest them? Would you send them on the way? I think what is the most difficult part is that marijuana impairment is not alcohol impairment.
Throughout this entire maneuver, I want you to look down at your feet, count your steps aloud, keeping your hands down by your side.
With marijuana impairment, it's mostly mental impairment.
Based on those, I would take you into custody if you were driving.
Yeah.
Think more distracted driving instead of drunk driving.
Attention task. So driving in itself is a divided attention task. So when you drive, you have to operate the pedals, you have to pay attention to traffic, you have to...
So if we're talking to young people, they might say, well, marijuana impaired driving, it's safer than alcohol. And what I like to say is, no, they're both impairing substances, they just impair differently.
It's much slower reaction time. The biggest thing with cannabis is time and distance distortion. So that's why they're stopping prior to the stoplight. They're driving very slow.
And because it's mental, I don't think that people are as conscious about it, nor is a friend gonna look and say, oh, I think you need to give me the keys.
180 degrees.
It's gonna be harder for people to assess.
You're going to bend forward at the waist at a 45-degree angle.
And again, I don't like the exchange of, well, it's safer than alcohol. Well, that's a dangerous risk to take when you're getting behind a multi-thousand pound potential weapon.
And then put your arms straight behind you like they're an airplane. Behind you, sorry. There you go. Okay, right now you're being placed under arrest for driving on the floor. Placed under arrest for driving on the floor.
Reagan's policies really became much harsher in terms of both the enforcement side of it, but also in terms of the penalties associated with drug crime violations. And so during the 1980s is when you have mandatory minimum sentencing. That's Reagan's contribution to the whole effort. And this continued under Clinton and under the first Bush. You know, I'm an academic, I teach and I do research, and one of the biggest problems with prohibition is that it's really stifled research of all sorts.
The funny thing is this plant's been around for thousands of years. Why weren't we researching it before? The only reason now all of a sudden it's a hot topic is because people see that there's value to the product. That's the only reason.
Now that I just have a little piece of candy, I get the pain relief, I get the relaxation, and I'm able to go about my life and still have the quality of life.
The research is inadequate as a whole, especially on the plant.
The more marijuana they used, the worse their learning and memory was.
So there are about 80 other cannabinoids that are just not well studied or understood.
Cannabis is a miracle plant, and the potential it has yet to be unlocked.
There were many concerns raised in the film New Marijuana, and we want to know what you think about what you saw in the documentary. So get in touch with us at newmexicoinfocus.org or find us on Twitter and Facebook. With me now to reflect on these issues is Mackenzie Allen, a retired deputy sheriff who worked in Los Angeles and Seattle. He was a training officer and an undercover narcotics detective. He's also a member of Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, or LEAP. Also with us is Jessica Halai, who is the policy coordinator for the Drug Policy Alliance in New Mexico. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Jessica, I want to start with you. Why should we legalize marijuana?
Well, thanks for having me, Gwyneth. It's no secret that we're in a major budget crunch in the state. It's beyond a crunch, really. It's a true crisis. And marijuana legalization represents a real, both innovative and proven way to grow our economy. So really, I think that it needs to be an option that's on the table because we have very few other options, and this is one that a sister state just to our north is seeing really great success with. $140 million is going to school education this year. We could really use that in New Mexico.
We could probably make a lot of tax money if we became a hub for production of pornography. But isn't there an argument against doing something people find immoral and destructive just for the money?
Well, I'm not sure exactly what is immoral about growing a plant and using it. You know, this is an agricultural crop, and it's something that, you know, really actually is true to our values and would grow our economy in a real way. It's an actual fiber that we can turn into a commodity and be used for a million different purposes, from textiles if we're talking about hemp to recreational adult use if we're talking about marijuana. I think that it's something that people have been using for thousands of years, and it's less than 100 years since we made it illegal. It's really a false construct.
So in terms of the interaction with law enforcement, we know that law enforcement officers all over the country spend a lot of time dealing with offenses related to marijuana. Right. If we legalized it here in New Mexico, what effect would that have on the officers out there on the street?
I think it would be more helpful to think of how it would affect the entire criminal justice system, but speaking just to street work, just to street cops, which I spent years doing. The first thing it would do, if it's completely legalized as opposed to decriminalized, if it's legalized, it's going to take away what many officers use as probable cause to advance further arrests, further investigation, leading often to more arrests of more serious offenders. It's the first step, and a legitimate step. So that would be gone. But having said that, what would it do to the court system? What would it do to the prison and jail populations? What would it do to the budget that's necessary to support those things? It would free up the courts dramatically. It would free up prison space, and it would give us much more room to lock down people who really need to be locked down, violent criminals, instead of letting them out early because of overcrowding situations. There would be a tremendous impact in many aspects of the criminal justice system.
And you're saying we would save money by not having to arrest these people, run them through trials, and then keep them in jail or prison?
Oh, we'd save a ton of money. It would ease up the public defender's office, which you're probably aware has recently been in the news regarding cutting back on what is available from the public defender's office. Everything's overwhelmed.
We have been watching, as you said, Jessica, what's been happening in Colorado. One of the things that I think some people were kind of surprised and upset about was these edible gummy bears, candies, things like that, that brightly colored, yummy looking things getting into the hands of kids who end up in the emergency room because they've eaten what is a fairly powerful dose. How is it that legalization would make kids safer?
Sure. Well, first of all, when we're talking about an illegal substance, if the kids are actually going to buy it, they're not being carded right now in the same way that they are with alcohol. So if you regulate it, then you put a system in place where children would not be able to purchase it.
You mean kids right now who are buying pot from their friend aren't carded, as opposed to a legal system where they do have to show a card?
Right, exactly. If it was at a store, they wouldn't be able to purchase it. They're not able to purchase tobacco, they're not able to purchase alcohol. Marijuana is easier to get because it's illegal. Secondly, education is a must. Public education and labeling, and we've learned a lot from Colorado. Colorado's learned a lot from Colorado, and they've put things in place now so that there is a lot more stringent labeling requirements that go along with these items. But just like anything else, kids shouldn't be getting into this, just like they shouldn't be getting into your liquor cabinet. And as if kids are taught that they need to stay out of it, and it's just like any other thing that we might not want our children to be part of. We can tell them what is best and ask them to behave responsibly and teach them what they can do to keep themselves safe.
Trust but verify. So tell them not to touch the stuff, then put it in the locked cabinet.
Right.
May I make a quick comment very quickly? We will never be able to arrest our way out of this. This is indeed a health and public awareness situation. I'm old enough to remember in the 50s when cigarettes were legal, doctors were on TV doing ads with their white coats and their stethoscopes hawking cigarettes. Well, it's taken almost 50 years, but people have finally, for the most part, or in many instances, gotten the message about smoking. That's what this is. We're never going to be able to criminalize our way out of this.
Let me ask you, we live in a state with incredibly high rates of driving while intoxicated. We have tremendous problems with substance abuse. Help us understand how legalizing marijuana would not aggravate those problems.
Well, the first thing we need to understand is that no one is excusing criminal behavior or irresponsible behavior behind the use of what would be a legal substance. So if someone is doing robberies or burglaries or even shoplifting, any kind of offense, to support a drug habit of any type of drug, then you punish and address that behavior. But if it's a victimless thing, if I'm sitting at home, by the way, I've never used any of these drugs, I don't advocate it. My drug of choice is a vodka martini or a glass of wine, but understand those are drugs. But if I'm sitting at home and want to get myself stoned and I'm not hurting anybody, I'm not on the road, I'm not endangering anybody, that is truly a victimless crime. And it's a crime now.
But with people who have substance abuse issues, having quick and easy access to a new way to get high, wouldn't that aggravate that problem?
It might temporarily, but there's a big forbidden fruit factor in this. When things are hard to get, there's this interest in pursuing it. When you go to a concert and somebody says something about marijuana and everybody starts to cheer, or some people starts to cheer, it's so immature. It's because it's forbidden at the moment. And it is indeed a health and public awareness issue.
I'm thinking about Gary Johnson right now because he's running for our former governor. He's running for president on the Libertarian ticket. The Libertarian platform endorses legalization of all drugs. But one of the arguments that the Drug Policy Alliance makes is legalize marijuana and then put in a rigorous system of regulation and taxation. And I can hear kind of a record scratch for Gary Johnson at that point saying, wait a minute. We should not have a rigorous, more big government system in here. How can we do this without creating this other giant government bureaucracy?
Well, I think that one thing is that we work with departments that are already here, like the regulation and licensing. We create a system where the policy would be administered by people who are already working in government, and perhaps create a new division, but certainly not a new department. The regulation, I think, is you know, I hear what you're saying. I think that it's important in order to protect the various types of players who might want to enter into the market. So having licenses for cottage cultivators, as well as groups that are interested in doing industrial processing of hemp, and everything in between, so that we have space for family business to be in the market, and we protect the interests of our New Mexico farmers and agriculture folks by doing that.
We only have one more minute, but I want to ask you, Mac, give me the elevator speech that you use when you are trying to persuade a fellow officer, hey, this is the way to go. This is why we should do this. You should join me, because why?
The bottom line is prohibition doesn't work. Prohibition has never worked. All you have to do is look at the late 20s and early 30s in this country. All it does is extend corruption and make money for the people in the black market. There will always be a black market in an illegal substance. If we outlawed French fries.
I got to get off at this floor.
Okay.
Jessica, give me the same speech that you would get if you found yourself lucky enough to be in the elevator with a group of state lawmakers.
This is an option that we must look at in order to grow New Mexico's economy. Marijuana legalization is proven and innovative, and it's something that New Mexico needs.
Thank you both for being with us, and I'm glad to hear your speeches.
Thanks for inviting me.
I'm Gene Grant. Thanks for joining us this week on New Mexico in Focus. Now, you can find a link to our discussions this week about marijuana legalization on our website, newmexicoinfocus.org. And as always, we appreciate your time and effort to stay informed and engaged. We'll see you next week in Focus.